Imagine you're a Roman general standing on the deck of your flagship at dawn. You're about to lead 120 warships into battle. Your enemy is waiting in the harbor ahead. Thousands of soldiers' lives depend on the decisions you make in the next few hours. But before you give any orders, before you strategize your attack, you have to consult chickens. Yup, chickens. Because the Romans believed that sacred chickens could predict the outcome of battles by the way they ate their breakfast. This isn't a myth or a legend. This is documented Roman military practice. And today we're going to explore one of the strangest and most fascinating roles chickens have ever played in human history. To understand the sacred chickens, we need to understand something fundamental about how the Romans viewed the world. They believed that the gods were constantly communicating with humans. You just had to know how to read the signs. This practice was called augury, and it was serious business. The word auspices, which you might still hear a version of today when we say something is auspicious, it comes from the Latin word avis, meaning bird, and specere, meaning to look at, so literally looking at birds. The Romans believed that birds, as creatures of the sky, were especially connected to the divine realm. The way birds flew, the direction they came from, even the sounds they made, all of these were messages from the gods. There were priests called augurs, whose entire job was to interpret these signs. Before any major political decision or military campaign, the augurs would watch the sky, observe the birds, and declare whether the gods approved of their planned actions. According to legend, this practice goes all the way back to the founding of Rome itself. Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers who supposedly founded the city, got into an argument about where to build it. They decided to settle the dispute by watching birds. Remus saw 6 vultures and Romulus saw 12. And so Rome was built where Romulus wanted, on the Palatine Hill. Whether or not that story is true, what it tells us is that augury was woven into the very foundation of Roman identity. It wasn't optional. It was how Rome operated. Now here's the problem with watching wild birds. They don't always show up when you need them. Imagine you're a general about to lead an army into battle. You need divine guidance. You need to know if the gods approve. But you're in a military camp, or worse, you're on a ship at sea. There might not be any convenient vultures or eagles flying around at exactly the moment you need to make your decision. So the Romans came up with a brilliant solution. They would bring their own birds with them. Portable prophecy, if you will. They started keeping flocks of chickens specifically for this purpose. These weren't just any chickens. They were sacred chickens, treated with reverence and kept under the care of a special priest called the Publius. The ritual was quite specific. At dawn, before a major military decision, the Publius would release the sacred chickens from their cage and scatter grain on the ground. Then everyone would watch very carefully how the chickens ate. If the chickens rushed out eagerly and ate with such enthusiasm that grain fell from their beaks and hit the ground, that was called the Tripudium Solistimum, the sacred dance. It was the best possible omen. The gods were pleased and victory was surely assured. But if chickens refused to come out of their cage, or they wouldn't eat, or if they scattered and ran away, that was a very bad sign. The gods disapproved. The action should be called off. Now, you might be thinking, couldn't they just starve the chickens beforehand to make sure they'd eat? And yes, that absolutely happened. Manipulation of the sacred chickens was apparently quite common. Bribery of the Publius was standard practice. The Romans weren't naive about this. But that's what makes what happened in 249 BC so remarkable. So it's 249 BC. Rome is 15 years into the First Punic War against Carthage, a massive struggle for control of the Mediterranean. The Romans have been trying to take Sicily, but it's been brutal. Tens of thousands have died. The Roman treasury is bleeding money, building and rebuilding fleets that keep getting destroyed. In command of the Roman fleet is Consul Publius Claudius Pulcher, and Pulcher has a plan. The Carthaginian fleet is anchored in the harbour of Drepana on the western coast of Sicily. Pulcher decides he's going to launch a surprise attack at dawn. So picture this, it's still dark. Pulcher has 120 conchyremes, huge warships with 5 banks of oars each, carrying about 300 men per ship. That's roughly 36,000 men under his command. They're sailing through the darkness towards Drepana, hoping to catch the Carthaginians off guard. But they've had to bring the sacred chickens with them on the flagship, because you can't make a major military move without consulting the chickens. As dawn breaks, it's time for the ritual. The Publius opens the cage and scatters the grain. The chickens refuse to eat. Some of them won't even come out of their cages. The ones that do come out won't touch the grain. This is the worst possible omen. The soldiers see it. Word spreads through the fleet. People start to panic. There are murmurs of mutiny. They want to turn back, or at least delay the attack. And this is where Pulcher makes his fateful decision. He's angry. He's been planning this attack. He's impatient. He doesn't want to believe in some superstitious nonsense about chickens. So he looks at the Publius and says, and these words have been recorded by multiple Roman historians, "If they will not eat, let them drink." And he picks up the sacred chickens and throws them overboard into the sea. The sacred chickens drowned deliberately by their commander. The fleet proceeds with the attack anyway, but of course it's a disaster. The Carthaginians aren't asleep. They were expecting something. They managed to get their fleet out of the harbour. They're more manoeuvrable than the heavier Roman ships, and they have the Romans pinned against the rocky shore. By the end of the day, Rome has lost 93 of its 120 ships. That's 28,000 men dead or captured. It's one of the worst naval defeats in Roman history. And the chickens had been right. Pulcher survived the battle, but he couldn't escape the consequences of what he'd done. He was recalled to Rome and put on trial, not for losing the battle. Military defeats happened. He was charged with treason for disrespecting the sacred chickens, for sacrilege, for angering the gods and bringing disaster on Rome. The trial was dramatic. They very nearly sentenced him to death. In the end, he was convicted of the lesser charge of sacrilege and sent into exile. His military and political career was over, all because he drowned some chickens. And here's what I find fascinating about this story. The Romans weren't stupid. They knew chickens were just chickens. They knew the system could be manipulated. That's why bribery and strategic feeding were common. But they also understood something we often forget today, that rituals and practices that force you to pause, to consider, to look for signs before rushing into action, those have value. Not because the chickens were actually magic, but because taking that moment to observe, to question, to look for red flags, that matters. The chickens weren't eating. Maybe they were seasick, as Pulcher suggested, but maybe they were stressed, confined, sensing something was wrong. And Pulcher, in his impatience and arrogance, ignored that warning sign. He ignored his own soldiers' concerns. He charged ahead anyway. And it cost Rome 28,000 men. The sacred chickens weren't just a Roman thing. Chickens have been part of religious and ceremonial practices across many cultures for thousands of years. We know that chickens were probably first domesticated not for food, but for cockfighting and religious ceremonies. Ancient peoples valued the rooster's fighting spirit, his loud crow at dawn, and the hen's protective care of her chicks. In many Asian cultures, chickens have been used in divination rituals. In some African traditions, the way a sacrificed chicken falls can reveal messages from ancestors. In parts of Indonesia, ritual cockfights are still part of funeral ceremonies. In ancient Greece, chickens were considered exotic animals, far too special to be used as just ordinary sacrifices. What all these practices share is this recognition that chickens, these small, everyday birds, somehow bridge the mundane and the sacred. Maybe it's because they've lived so closely with us for so long. Maybe it's because they wake us at dawn, marking the boundary between darkness and light. Maybe it's because they're both wild enough and domestic enough to feel like messengers between worlds. I think about this sometimes when I'm out here with my own flock. These are heritage breeds, descendants of those ancient lineages that have lived alongside humans for thousands of years. The Romans kept chickens, the Egyptians kept chickens. People in Southeast Asia were keeping chickens 3,500 years ago. And every single one of those cultures at some point looked at chickens and saw something more than just a source of eggs and meat. They saw creatures worth paying attention to. So what do we take from the story of Rome's sacred chickens? Maybe it's a reminder that the way we relate to animals has always been complicated. We've always seen them as both practical and somehow symbolic, both ordinary and extraordinary. The Romans eventually went on to win the First Punic War, by the way. 7 years after Drepana, they built yet another fleet and finally defeated Carthage at the battles of the Agates. They became the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean for the next 600 years. But They didn't forget the lesson of the sacred chickens. Military augury continued to be practiced. Generals kept consulting the chickens before battles because the Roman Senate had decided that respecting the ritual, taking that pause, looking for signs, not rushing in with arrogance, that was more important than any individual leader's impatience. The next time you're watching your chickens, maybe take a moment to appreciate that you're participating in something ancient. Humans have been watching chickens, learning from chickens, even asking chickens for advice for thousands of years. The chickens probably don't care about that history, but I think it matters that we remember it.